perhaps the most tempting analysis when we think of human rights and religion is to assume that those two things are in opposition, or if not always in opposition, at the very least in tension with each other. Here in Northern Ireland, where religious discourse is dominated by Christianity, we often see conservative Catholic and evangelical Protestant morality doctrines converging to produce resistance at a social and political level to some civil and political rights. The most obvious examples would be issues like same-sex marriage and adoption, recognition of gender identity, abortion access, the rights of LGBT people to access services without discrimination. Who can forget the failed Conscience Clause Bill of 2014, at the launch of which Peter Linus from the Evangelical Alliance gave an address expressing his organisation's support for such legislation. Now, theologians, religious scholars, and sociologists of religion have written extensively on the patriarchal and the anti-sex basis of such religious interference when it comes to issues of gender and sexuality. Globally, there are similar tensions apparent across a whole range of contexts. We see it in some Muslim majority countries, in Catholic states in the global south, in conservative evangelical communities in some African nations like Uganda that have been heavily influenced by American-based Christian NGOs. We see the role of conservative Hinduism in maintaining social hierarchies in India. So the global picture of how official religion influences human rights and dignity, particularly for marginalized people, is not a pretty one. There are, of course, many intervening factors, things that have very little to do with genuine religious experience and much more to do with power or fear or supremacy. There is the legacy of colonialism and imperialism across the world that has cultivated suspicion of the international human rights framework as an imposition of Western values. Conflict plays its role. Conflict within and across states can drive political expressions of religious morality that in competing ethno-religious groups that are far more conservative than what most ordinary people actually believe or practice in their own lives. And of course, economic inequality often makes the realization of rights an uneven playing field. And yet religious authorities rarely turn their attention to addressing this issue, instead choosing to only embrace human rights when it is to protect their own freedom to express religious beliefs in the public square. So it's hardly surprising that some people coming from a secular worldview would prefer that religion and human rights were kept apart. There is animosity and distrust on both sides. The complexity of all those big social and political issues is very hard to unravel, and so people just retreat into their separate camps. But when you look at the question of religion and human rights on a personal level, on a human level, this kind of polarization is rarely what we find. It could be someone's had a religious experience, a religious upbringing that has instilled certain values in them. It could be that someone has a personal faith that provides comfort and sustenance for their work, for the journey, a love of scripture that challenges them and inspires them, or an experience of spirituality that gives a kind of transcendent meaning to all of the ways that people impact each other's lives. I personally have met so many human rights advocates over the years who carry all of this complexity and nuance in their own journey in having faith within a human rights context. And then at a larger scale, the picture is obviously not as bleak as the one that I just painted a minute ago. We know that around the world, many NGOs, grassroots activists, religious scholars, religious institutions are working to challenge that dichotomy between religion and human rights. Whether that's engaging religious leaders in the achievement of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, harnessing the power of churches to resist state social policy that impoverishes people, or religious leaders stepping up to oppose the detention and incarceration of vulnerable people. all of these things are happening, even if they're not the focus of the debate. And often they're not the focus of the debate because the media and the news agenda doesn't really like nuance. So I want to acknowledge as well that we have a legacy of this kind of religiously motivated humanitarianism and human rights advocacy here in Northern Ireland. There are a number of faith leaders we could have invited to speak here this evening. However, I particularly wanted us to hear from people who've made their mark in the arena of human rights and not necessarily with an obvious religious motivation. I personally have felt over the years that in Northern Ireland, it's hard to wear both hats. People want to put us into boxes. Some people want to claim us for their side of every argument. So I feel I've certainly hidden my faith light under a bushel in order to get on with the monumental task of trying to seek justice for people. So for tonight, I'm delighted to be able to invite these three, hopefully three when Alan arrives, human rights activists who I think will be able to help us illuminate the faith story behind the work, the values that they turn to when they face dilemmas, the struggle we have when the beliefs we grew up with aren't big enough to meet the challenge of an unequal world, the reality of what freedom of religion looks like whenever you're from a minority faith in a place where faith is automatically assumed to mean Christian. I don't know about you, but I think this is going to be a very interesting and enlightening conversation. So without any further waffle from me, and I'm very glad I got through all that because I do have COVID and my brain is working on about 2% power at the minute. I'm going to now introduce our panel. So we have tonight Nazia Latif, who's a human rights expert and co-founder of Right Practice. Nazia has many years of experience in promoting human rights in the public sector in particular, including 13 years working in investigations and policy at the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission. During her time there, she undertook systemic investigations into race hate crime, the rights of older people in nursing homes, immigration detention, and she also led on a groundbreaking project to develop a human rights-based approach to complaints decisions in the Northern Ireland Ombudsman's Office. So you're very welcome, Nazia. Thank you for joining us. I'm also going to introduce Ciara. Ciara Fitzpatrick is a social security researcher and lecturer at Ulster University School of Law and one of the team behind the excellent award-winning Ulster University Law Clinic. She's an experienced campaigner on social security rights, a founding member of the Cliff Edge Coalition on welfare reform mitigations, and that's work that she undertook during her time at the Law Centre NI. So thank you, Ciara, for joining us as well. Alan, if you're out there, give me a shout and I'll introduce you, but I don't have you so far. Okay, well, we'll have to. If anybody has his number, you can give him a ring. We're going to kick off then by with you, Ciara, if that's okay. I've asked each of our panel to give some introductory remarks, just introducing themselves, where this issue fits in your own journey, and just any thoughts that you want to share to start off the conversation. So Ciara, over to you.
That's great. Maybe Alan's having a few technical issues because I can't see anybody. All I can see is a black screen. So I'm not sure if you can see me or not, but I'm too afraid to touch anything. So I'm just going to start talking and hope for the best.
We can't see you, so that's a good start.
Oh, great. Maybe it's a good thing that I can't see myself. So yes, my name's Ciara Fitzpatrick and I'm at Ulster University School of Law, and I've been thinking quite a bit about what I should talk about in my little 5 or 10 minutes, and I suppose I'm just going to be really quite personal about my relationship with faith and the campaigning and activism and human rights interests that I have. So I was brought up a Catholic, and really a pretty devout Catholic at that. So you know, we never missed mass without fail on a Sunday, unless I got to go with my dad and we took a wee drive around town instead with a Diet Coke in the papers, but that only happened a couple of times. Don't tell my mum. But I am a Catholic, and I went through the Catholic school system, and Catholic grammar school as well, and faith has been a huge part of my upbringing. I'm also from rural County Derry, and my mum is one of 12 children, and I have a huge circle of cousins, about 52 first cousins on my mum's side alone, and we all live together, and faith is a massive part of all of our lives, and it really dictates how we all live our lives in terms of, you know, kind of unwritten rules or unspoken rules that we in the family are all expected to abide by, and it is really that traditional in terms of, you know, we were expected to not move in with our partners before we were married, and to abstain from drink until we were at least 18. And you know, I think our rural upbringing and the upbringing that my parents had, and indeed their parents had, has travelled down, and I really felt that kind of formal side of the faith. As well as that, I have turned to prayer very often if I've felt stress in my life or anxiety in my life, or if someone in my life is sick and needs prayers. I turn to prayer. I still turn to prayer. In my own family at the minute, there's a couple of people who are seriously ill, and you know, no matter what's happening, I turn to prayer, and I find that it centers and grounds me for sure. COVID has disrupted my formal worship in terms of going to mass, and I'm trying to get that back on track a little bit, because if truth be told, when I started out my activism, it really did challenge my faith, and really that comes down to how disappointed I am in the relationship that the institution of the Catholic Church has with issues that I am passionate about, for example, poverty. So, as well as being a lecturer in social security law, as well as being an activist and founding the Cliff Edge Coalition, I also have been a volunteer and a conference president for my local St Vincent de Paul, which is attached to St Patrick's Parish in Donegal Street in North Belfast. I've recently just given that role up because I have moved back to County Derry, so family definitely has a big pull. But when I was in St Vincent de Paul, we were connected to the local parish, and we basically, our role was to take phone calls from people who are in desperate need and material need. We would talk to them on the phone, talk to them about their lives, and talk to them how we could help. And we would go out and visit them in their own homes, and really lend a listening ear, and then offer them material help. And that material help come from collections on a Sunday from mass, or collections over the weekend from mass. So very, very interlinked. But what I would say is that I have been very disappointed at, I suppose, the failure of the church to really weigh in heavily on poverty issues in Northern Ireland. So we have been going out in St Patrick's Parish, which is probably one of the poorest parishes in Northern Ireland. It covers the New Lodge, it covers the Lower Antrim Road, it covers the Shankill. People who are basically, who are living in destitution. And we see firsthand how difficult it is for these people. But while I was a member of St Vincent de Paul, there was basically a barrier to me speaking publicly about what I was seeing on the ground, about what people were experiencing. And this ultimately caused me a lot of stress in the organisation. So if I did speak about it on the radio, and that was not using any names or, you know, trying to keep it as confidential as possible, really just using anonymized case studies. If I tried to talk about it in the media or even talk about my role in St Vincent de Paul, I would receive a very swift phone call from the powers that be above me in the parish, to tell me that I couldn't talk anymore and that I had to keep quiet, and that I was breaking confidentiality or privacy, and also that I wasn't a media spokesperson, and so I wasn't able to talk about what I was seeing and what was happening. And this really, really frustrated me. It really got to me, because I was like, people need to know how bad it is, and this can actually help draw attention to just the issue of poverty and how serious it is in Northern Ireland. So I've really struggled with that over my time as a volunteer. And the second thing I've struggled with is just the overall failure of the churches to really get behind campaigns that the Cliff Edge Coalition have been running, that other organisations have been running, particularly around issues like the two-child limit. So the two-child limit is a social security rule, which means you will only receive universal credit for your first 2 children. And obviously there's a huge tension between this and the very strong pro-life message that comes particularly from the Catholic Church, but all the churches in Northern Ireland. And there hasn't been a dicky bird from any of the Catholic churches about how just abhorrent this rule is and how awful it is. There's been nobody to speak publicly about it. And I have called publicly on church leaders to, really condemn the two-child limit and to get behind campaigns for making sure that it can be abolished, because the church does play such a serious role here. And again, there has been a deafening silence. The two-child limit, the benefit cap, universal credit, all of those issues are crippling families at the minute. Women are particularly suffering, and the church's increasing response seems to be food banks and charitable responses, which of course do have their place, and traditionally the church has always played that role. But there are so many issues in regards to that nexus or the intersection between charity and church, and how volunteers in the church who are dealing with people in the front line, how they see that person, how they treat that person. And really, it shouldn't be their role to decide how deserving or undeserving that person is of support. Another thing that has torn me apart really as a volunteer in St Vincent de Paul, I have some people coming to me week after week, and I feel that it shouldn't be me who decides that they shouldn't be eligible for support anymore, because they've been coming on a weekly basis and we have other people that we need to see to. And I don't feel it should be my role to decide how much they receive in support or what they spend that support on, whether they should get it in the form of cash or whether they should get it in the form of a voucher or whatever it is. But organisations like St Vincent de Paul, like Salvation Army, like the Trussell Trust, like church-run food banks, some of which are huge operations, are making critical decisions like this about people every day, and that really, really bothers me. And it's really spreading to such a level whereby charity is actually the main source of crisis support for people here who are facing destitution in Northern Ireland. So yes, that's kind of where I'm at the minute. Personally, I do have a faith. I very much lean on God. I very much rely on prayer. But in terms of the Catholic institutions and other church institutions, I feel really disappointed and let down by them. I suppose I should also say I recently completed another piece of work with a group of amazing academics, mostly women and feminist academics, about mother and baby homes in Ireland, following on from the release of the government's independent report on mother and baby homes in the Republic of Ireland. And we kind of did a rewrite of that report, and I looked at the social welfare aspect, and you know, I was absolutely horrified. It included reading through all of the testimonies, other reports that have been written, a lot of desk-based research on how people were treated. And you know, I was in tears, to be quite honest, just reading the testimonies of women and how they were treated by the church and by the institutions. You know, they were imprisoned, they were starved, their babies were starved, it was just horrendous abuse. So I'm finding great tension, great and deep tension, and you know, I'm not sure how to resolve that tension. I'm not sure where to go next. I very much know there are individual people in the church who are working hard on these issues, but there is not one united voice against poverty here, against abuse here, and I'm finding that really hard to cope with. So I'm really interested to hear other people's perspectives on that. I'm really interested to hear what people think about the huge growth in charitable provision and the difficulty that causes for people of faith, and you know, again, the difficulty that causes for people who are coming to organisations that are church run, especially if they don't share the same faith. So there are some kind of questions that I have in my head and that I'd love to hear from participants on. And I feel like I've rambled on now for way more than 10 minutes, so I'm going to end it there. But thanks very much, Kellie, for letting me come along. It's definitely a conversation that I've wanted to have for a long time.
Thank you, Ciara. That was really powerful. And yes, I can tell there was a lot that you needed to get off your chest there. So thank you. That was good. You've set up a really brilliant starter for us there, focusing on socioeconomic rights, which is fantastic because it's not what normally gets the attention in the rights and religion debates. And yet, as you've pointed out, it's crucial and it's affected people's lives. I'm going to add to the spotlight then Mr. Alan McBride. Thank you for joining us. I'm not going to put you totally in the spotlight and make you go next, Alan, because that would just be horrible.
Can I just say apologies first of all for not reading the email? I thought it was 7 o'clock, and I've actually told a lot of friends as well it was 7 o'clock on the register. So I don't know. Anyway, apologies, guys, but glad to be here now.
Don't worry at all, Alan, and we are recording it, so we'll be able to. And chances are we'll still be going at 7. So. But I'm going to turn now to Nazia and invite you to give us some of your opening remarks.
Thanks very much, Kellie, and thanks for inviting me to this. I was actually going to ask you to set up a poll to start this off and call the poll Guess My Religion, but I'll tell you what it is up front. I'm a Muslim, and first of all, just again to put it up front, I'm not part of any religious entity, a mosque or a centre or society. I'm speaking on behalf of myself, not of anyone else. And one of the reasons I set up on my own was that I would never have to speak on behalf of anyone else or toe a corporate line ever again. And I'm also not a theologian, so just to put those two things out there. I could really relate to so much of what Ciara was saying there. As a Muslim, just the importance of the family and the extended family, which can be a beautiful thing, but can be a downright pain in the ass sometimes as well, when they all know your business and they all know or need to know where you're going and who you've been with and when you'll be back. And so there's a lot of similarities there. But I suppose reflecting on what Kellie asked us to talk about in terms of our pathway to human rights work, for me, like Ciara, the family was a very big influence in terms of how I came to view the world. And my mum especially was a deeply spiritual person, and there was something very beautiful about that. And I think there is something very beautiful about deeply spiritual people, that sort of acceptance of things, but that bravery as well that goes with it. And it's hard to articulate sometimes unless you've actually witnessed it. So my parents were first generation immigrants. They were a religious and an ethnic minority. And so I saw all the challenges that came with that. So there were Muslims desperately trying to source halal meat in Northern Ireland in the 1960s and 70s. My mom was a vegetarian, not for religious reasons, but she was desperately trying to source aubergines and corianders when no one in Northern Ireland knew what those things were. They were sort of exotic things that no one here knew. And then world politics was a really big thing in our house, especially Palestine and South Africa. And these were discussed a lot at home. And we didn't buy South African goods. We didn't buy Israeli products. And we were very clear that Nelson Mandela was not a terrorist. And for the younger people out there, that wasn't a unanimously held view in Northern Ireland. In fact, it was quite a controversial one in some circles. So those views were inextricably linked to my faith and to our view of the world and how people should be treated and how certain things were just unacceptable. And of course, apartheid was just unacceptable. And there was lots of other things that I wasn't so sure about growing up in Northern Ireland, but I was certain that I was a Muslim, and that meant that I had a certain responsibility towards others, and that there was also certain boundaries that I had to operate within and that I had to observe. But being a woman certainly wasn't a barrier to achieving anything, and I was always clear that in my religion those boundaries existed equally for men and women. So I was definitely a feminist before I was a human rights activist, and that's really what sort of, I suppose, inspired me to find out more about my religion from a scholarly point of view and from a theological point of view, as well as a personal and a spiritual one. And that led me to come across this saying of the Prophet Muhammad. And the saying goes like this. It says, whoever sees an evil deed should change it with his hands, if not then with his tongue, and if not then condemn it in your heart, and that is the weakest of faith. And we can have a discussion about what evil is, but for me it's very clear. For me, evil is injustice, and for me that's really what Islam was about as well. It was about fighting injustice, it was about fighting the power structures that were in place at that time. So how do I do that in the 21st century, living in Northern Ireland? What's my framework? What's my tool for challenging injustice? And for me, it's human rights law. Now, it's not a perfect tool and it's not a perfect framework, but I think it's the best one that we have. And I don't really see any contradiction in that, between that and my religion and my space here in what is supposed to be a secular society. And I suppose, like human rights, Islam is built on this very clear concept that we're all owed dignity and respect, just simply by the fact that we've been born, by the fact that we're human beings. It doesn't matter where we were born, it doesn't matter who our parents are. I was just having this discussion actually with a friend the other day, and I was trying to explain why everyone calls my husband by his first name, by his second name and not his first name. And I was explaining to her that the concept of surnames in Islam is actually quite alien. Everyone has their own name. We don't inherit our parents' names because we are ourselves. We make our own place in the world. We don't get to hang off anyone's coattails. That's who we are ourselves. And a lot of companions of the Prophet were actually known by their children's names. So Abu Bakr was the father of someone called Bakr, and Salama was the mother of someone, of her daughter. That's how she was known. And the concept of changing your name after marriage is a very new and sort of Western one in a lot of Muslim countries. So, and a Muslim scholar was asked this at a lecture, this concept of women changing his names. And he said, well, a woman could be married any number of times in a lifetime. Why on earth would she change her name every time she gets married? And my mum never changed her name, which was really something quite alien for her time, and I've never changed my name, and it's never been questioned as to why I haven't. So this concept of being who you are and celebrating who you are, not who you're related to, not where you were born, is very much, I suppose, part of the faith that I observe. And I know there's different versions of it, but that's certainly the one that's dear to me. And Kellie also asked to think about, in the way that Ciara very eloquently did there, about the sort of the tensions and the contradictions between our human rights work and our religion, and how that impacts on our personal life, and if we've ever had any struggles with our communities. And I suppose for me, I think there's tensions and contradictions everywhere, is there not? you know, as human rights activists, we still can't quite bring ourselves to delete that Facebook account, even though we know everything we know about Facebook. And sometimes Amazon is just so flipping convenient, isn't it? Just get it the next day if you don't have to go out. And don't get me started on transfer tests. I've just been through that whole process. So I think our life is full of contradictions, and I think we all struggle at different levels between what we aspire to be and the realities of our lives as well. And I suppose for me, the tensions is really always, am I doing enough? Because that's what I'm going to be answerable for in the capacity that I have as a human being. So do I look enough into supply chains to make sure my purchases are ethical? Do I really know what my ethical pensions fund is all about? You know, and I sit on the board of an organisation, and I think if someone came to me that was being bullied and harassed, would I step up to the mark and bend the rules and see how I could help them? Or would I talk about policies and procedures and blah, 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 and I can't help you, and here's a grievance process, go through that? So I think for me, that's where the tensions are. And as for the community, I think from the Muslim community in Northern Ireland, there's a sort of a mild amusement that there's a human rights commission and there's organisations doing human rights work, because no one's ever reached out to them. And there is a real feeling of that, and particularly amongst the younger generation, where they're just desperate to leave, where they don't see a place here for them. And I think that's where I struggle with my human rights work, is how do we make it for the next generation, whether they be Muslim or Catholic or Protestant or atheist or agnostic. And I think that's a real challenge. I can totally see the tensions between organised religion, between what certain sects practice or what they preach and what human rights law has to say. But I think there's more in common than there is more than that brings us apart. And I just want to finish with what Ciara was saying, because I think that the whole concept of socioeconomic rights is so fundamental to the human rights movement. And it actually really shocked me what Ciara was saying about feeling that, because I would have thought if there's one thing that religion could agree on, is that we have to help poor people. So I find that surprising. And the other thing I find, looking at some literature on Islam, is that we don't actually have a concept of charity in Islam. We have this Arabic word called sadqa, and it's often incorrectly translated as charity, but actually it means a right. It's a right that people from socially deprived backgrounds have, and that makes me a duty bearer to pay that sadqa. And when we're talking about how much, it's quite simple what I would spend. If I'm giving someone enough food for a week, well, it's what I would eat in a week. It's what my children would eat in a week. And so those concepts get completely lost. And I'm sure they're there in Catholicism. I'm sure they're there in all organised religions, but they completely get lost in the translation whenever we start thinking about structures and institutions and power and who has it and who doesn't have it. And I think if we can take that out of it, then the commonalities between human rights and religion are far more powerful than the differences. So I'm going to leave it at that. Now, I don't want to preempt some of the more sort of difficult questions about the tensions between Islam and human rights. And so I'll leave the participants to bring those up. But thanks, Kellie. Thanks for the opportunity, and thanks for listening.
Thank you, Nazia, for another great introduction and for painting, I think, what felt like a very hopeful picture as well of just when on that deeply personal level of how faith actually grows within us in our own journey. And as you said there when you were talking, you see no obvious contradiction there. I think that's something that is very hopeful for a lot of people to hear as we think about how that's happened in our own lives. So Alan, I'm going to do your introduction now, Alan, because I was saving it so you could hear it. So you could hear all the, everybody loves hearing all the nice things being said about them. So our final panelist this evening is Alan McBride, a well-known victims campaigner and centre coordinator with WAVE Trauma Centre. Alan's work has ensured that the stories and voices of victims of conflict are heard. He's had a huge impact on reconciliation and post-conflict transformation, as well as campaigning for long overdue entitlements for the bereaved and injured, such as the Troubles pension. Alan is also a former commissioner with the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission. Alan, thank you, and you're very welcome. And over to you.
Okay, well, thank you, Kellie, and thank you everybody that had a hand in organising tonight. I know that quite often people of faith and human rights are pitched against one another, and and I often find that that's actually really unfair. And I'm just glad that we've had this conversation tonight. And I suppose my contribution is trying to have some understanding of where sometimes people of faith come from in terms of our own journey, and certainly. Listen to the previous speakers, Nazia, and that talking about their journey, and I'm going to give you a sense of mine as well. And I want to start by saying something really, 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 really strange, because I kind of have can never remember a time when I haven't actually believed in God. I think I was born believing in God, and when I say that, I mean God as a creator. I obviously had a very active church life when I was very young, despite having two parents who were very keen churchgoers and certainly sent us out on a Sunday religiously to go to church, but themselves never actually had a living faith until much later in life. In fact, after my wife was tragically killed on the Shankill bomb. But I learned a lot through going to church. I grew up in a loyalist housing estate. My father was a member of the UDA when I was very, very young. In fact, I can remember my father, who was a very, very active Protestant as well. And my sister, my older sister, I have a sister actually is on listening to this tonight, but my other sister, Yvonne, started going out with a fella who happened to be Roman Catholic. And my dad was really, really distraught at the prospect of my sister going out with this Roman Catholic fella. And I remember one day he said to me, Alan, would you have a word with your sister Yvonne about going out with this Roman Catholic fella? And I says, well, what's wrong with who she's going out with? She says, well, he's in the dark. And I says, what do you mean he's in the dark? And he says, well, he doesn't have a faith. He says, Yvonne doesn't have a faith either. So what's the issue? And she says, but he said then, but at least she has access to the faith, and he was almost assuming this because this guy was a Catholic, that he was somehow in darkness. And my uncle Cecil, actually, my sister Elaine, who's on, actually will probably verify a lot of these stories, was another guy that had a big influence in my life growing up. Again, a man who had a very deep Christian faith. I can remember actually quite sad actually that Elaine and I were, when he passed away, we were in clearing his flat out, and he'd kind of been just a single guy all his life. And we came across this, which I think was
We've lost you briefly there, Alan. You're frozen. Just while Alan's connection kind of recovers, I'm going to just say to everyone who's here, in terms of participation, if you have questions for our panelists, be great if you could maybe summarize them. I know it's hard to summarize the whole question in text form, but if you could pop a quick note and a bit of a summary of your question into the chat. My plan is to be able to go to each person to ask their question, but just to keep track of the questions coming in using the chat, because the hand raise functions and all that, when you're on your own trying to host, it's quite difficult to see those going up. So we'll hopefully get Alan back in any second, but do start, if you've got questions or comments that you want to make to contribute to the discussion, do start popping those into the chat anytime you like. Alan is back.
Hello. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yep.
Sorry, there's something wrong. I'm not sure whether it's the storm mode, but our internet's been intermittent most of the day. So anyway, so he would have looked at my mother and he'd have said something along the lines of, would you look at John Fenian bitch? And he swore that this woman was a Catholic just because of the way she looked. She had a Fenian look about her, whatever that was. And when you're growing up in that environment, you start to listen to all this nonsense. That you can tell Catholics in Plasses Park just because of the way they looked, and of course that's completely bunkum for me. He also would have said things like that all Catholics had ginger hair, stuff like that, which I always found very amusing, given that my family, there was 6 kids in our house and 3 of them had ginger hair, but never did he stop to think of just how much nonsense was being spoken. But when you are growing up and you're in that environment and you're listening to all this stuff, you're kind of influenced by it. And it wasn't really until I started to volunteer with the 174 Trust that I started to see a different side of Christianity. I met Christians down there who were not trying to convert Roman Catholics, as most people that I was working with in the church would have been. I mean, when I went to work for the 174 Trust, people were saying, "Oh, that's great down there, converting them wee Catholics," and that's really what it was about. That's why I was there. That was the attraction for me. I was a fundamentalist evangelical. I would have taken Bible tracts and was giving them out on a Sunday afternoon or a Saturday afternoon in Belfast city centre. Quite common. You see those guys about with the big sandwich boards. I never quite wore a sandwich board, but certainly I was there when people with sandwich boards were there and they were handing out gospel tracts. I can remember also doing door-to-door work in Taggers Bay. As a young Christian, because I was a very, very much a right-winger fundamentalist, and again, it was all about converting people. And I remember there was a guy called Keith Green, who was a singer-songwriter in the Christian church and had written and made many, many records. And he had said this thing in one of his records about that going to McDonald's won't make you a hamburger. Going to church won't make you Christian any more than going to McDonald's and make you a hamburger. That's what he said. And I remember I was on the doors with this wee woman, and in Taggers Bay, everybody seemed to go along to Eric Smith's church at the bottom of Limestone Road. And so I was just getting fed up with door after door people tell me, "Oh, we're okay, son. We go to wee Eric's church." And I thought I would try out this line of Keith Green's. And so I ended up saying to this wee woman, "You know, Mrs., going to church is not going to make you a hamburger any more than going to McDonald's to make you a Christian." And I completely fluffed the lines. And she looked at me and she sort of says, "What?" But so anyways, I suppose the point I'm making is that, I was there, I was influenced by others in the church. I absolutely was a card-carrying fundamentalist, and it wasn't until I went to work for the 174 Trust and I met Christians who had come from other parts of the UK and actually lived and worked in the area. And rather than trying to convert those young people that were coming in, they actually sat with them and they were with them in the darkness. I remember when people like Billy Kane, who would have been a young person, was coming into the 174 Trust at the time, was murdered, shot in the house by loyalists in the middle of the New Lodge. And I remember going there as a young person. I grew up in the Westland, which was like a mile away from the New Lodge, but I can remember going to that house and just being with his mother and building up relationships with those young people. And I mean, Sharon and I both would have been very well respected working for the 174 Trust, which is why whenever the bomb happened on the 23rd of October in '93, it was so difficult for a lot of those young people. A lot of them couldn't come near church. Couldn't come near the salt shaker. If I was there, they didn't know what to say to me. And it wasn't until about 20 years later that I met up with many of them. We had a reunion and they were coming out and they were embracing me and they were crying and they didn't know what to do at the time because they were young Republicans, and yet here was this atrocity that had happened in their name, and they would have supported the organizations that would have been carrying out these kind of atrocities. So I think that whole relationship really confused them. But I think these days, coming into where I'm at now, having come through all that fundamentalist evangelical experience, and I'm still a Christian. I still go to a Presbyterian church these days in Bloomfield, quite close to where I live. I very strongly have a Christian faith. I believe in God. But I also believe it's about reaching out and about accepting people. I don't think that ours is the role to judge. I think that's up to God himself. And I think all we've been called to do really is to show love and to show kindness and to be salt and light. And I think that's why for me, and this is the relationship, I think, between human rights and the Christian church, because I think as Christians and as human rights activists, we should always be on the side of the wee person. We should always be on the side of the small person. In fact, it was actually Eleanor Roosevelt that said that if human rights were going to become real, they had to become real in places like churchyards and factories and schoolyards. And if you translate that into Northern Ireland, for human rights to be real, they have to be real in places like the Shankill and the Falls Road. So we need to get out of our churches and we need to get into communities and we need to sit with people in the darkness. We need to be walking with people as they're walking to Mary Stopes rather than standing outside and throwing fetuses in their face and stuff like this. So I'm deeply embarrassed how some Christians have treated others. But I have to say to you, as someone who actually straddles both camps of being a human rights activist and someone who has a very much a living Christian faith, I'm also deeply embarrassed by some of the actions of human rights activists as well, because quite often, and I worked for the Commission for about 6 years, which was a great experience. Opened my eyes to all sorts of things around human rights, but also opened my eyes to the fact that the human rights sector, particularly the higher up you go, is actually filled with people with egos. And I don't think necessarily it's about standing with the small person. I think sometimes, I remember when Michael O'Flaherty was the Human Rights Commissioner, the man with the silver tongue that I called him, because he could talk for Ireland. And I remember being in a summer school that he was doing over in Nottingham. And we had these human rights activists come and were talking to us. And one guy came and actually took an hour to talk about himself in terms of his CV and in terms of what he had done and what he hadn't done. And there was very, very little of it was about actually the small person, the wee person. And I think, if we're going to be true, and if I'm going to be true to my faith and true to Jesus Christ, who I believe in, because I think that Jesus himself was a person that always stood with the small person. He stood with the hurting person. He stood with the person who was in trouble. And that's where my Christian faith comes from. It's not a judgmental Christian faith. I oppose fundamentalism in all of its kinds, no matter whether it's Christian fundamentalism, Islamic fundamentalism, or indeed, I have a friend who's an atheist, who I describe as an atheist fundamentalist. He doesn't see himself that way, but he absolutely is, because he's the person that's trying to convert me, and he's trying to get me to read the latest book by Dawkins or Hitchens or whoever. I keep teasing him about the fact that he's limited by his imagination. In other words, that if he doesn't understand something, he doesn't believe in it. And I think that's really sad to lock yourself into that kind of mindset, because sometimes it's actually quite good to believe in something that you don't totally understand. And I'll be honest with you, if I'm going to be pressed tonight about matters of theology, I'll put my hands up and say I really don't understand it all at all. But I firmly believe that there's a creator God. I firmly believe that God loves people, and I firmly believe that he sent his people, his disciples, his followers into the world to be salt and light. And if we're not being salt and we're not being light, well then I think maybe we need to question whether or not we have a faith at all. So I will leave it there, and I'm absolutely open for questions if this internet connection lasts.
Thank you very much, Alan. Another really powerful introduction there. And you've brought something into focus there for me that I think has been building through all three of the contributions we've had from the panel. And it's to do with power, and just whether or not it's religious authorities or churches or religious individuals, or whether or not it's the human rights world and the human rights institutions, that the question of how you position yourself in relation to power is really important, and that we can have too cozy a relationship with power, or we can have a relationship with power that, as Alan just said, is about, speaking up for those who've been marginalized, who've been disempowered, who've been oppressed, rather than trying to be friends with the powerful and maintain the status quo. So we're open for questions. So anybody who wants to, we have a couple of comments in the chat. So David, would you like to go first?
Yeah.
And you're just kind of a comment, kind of just building on what Ciara talked about. Far on there.
Yeah, very much so. Thank you to all, and it's been very helpful and informative. I used to be a councillor in Belfast City Hall, but I also volunteer with Storehouse, now a food bank, and it's very much what Ciara was saying really annoys me, is that food banks shouldn't exist if there's good theology and good politics. They shouldn't be there at all, but we are where we are. Just trying to, yeah, and it's I think it's just that bad politics, that bad theology. I'd love to talk with you more. I'm just fed up of churches and just seeing it as a nice thing. We're ticking the box. We're doing this nice thing and helping people. We're not creating change. So I'd love to have a conversation more about it, because I've fallen out with Evangelical Alliance over stuff, and other big churches as well, because Bethel as well, because of their political stance and things. And I just find it really hurting to see what's going on. And but there are lots of good things going on as well with churches. So I hope that covers what I was meant to say, but yeah.
Thank you, David. Is there anything here you want to come back to on those questions, particularly that whole idea around is there a better theology, is there a way to like really speak to churches and call them to something different, a different way of approaching these issues?
I'm really interested in how we might approach it better, and because sometimes it's really hard to get to the person or the people that you need to speak to. I think there's still a lot of opaqueness around the church hierarchy and who makes the decisions, and who can actually say, yes, this is something that we need to speak out on, and this is something we need to get behind. I did go to an event with the Assembly of Churches, and I spoke to one priest, and I said, look, why, Jesus very much left us to spread the word of God, and his big message was, as Alan very eloquently put it, is we have to be here for the people who don't have a voice. We have to be here for the people who are unable to participate for whatever reason it might be. We have to be fighting for those people who are destitute and who need state support, not charitable support. And yet that priest said back to me that we can't be political. It's not our place to be political. But I very much think that they should not be political per se, but they should have very strong human rights and faith messages, which are very, as Nazia said, that are very complementary of one another, and that fit well together, and particularly around socioeconomic issues, whereby all of the kind of teaching of the church has also always said that we should provide for those who have nothing. So that's why I think it is so frustrating. David, I can hear the frustration in your voice, and I just feel the exact same as you. That is why it's so frustrating that the church institutions formally won't come out and say, look, politicians, you are doing a really bad job. You are letting people down. You are failing people. We have increased people coming to us, to the food bank, to churches for support, and this is not the way it's supposed to be. So yeah, I'm not sure, David, though, how we go about trying to influence change in that. And I do feel that sometimes the response that you get is to shut you down, rather to actually engage in conversation with you. Like I found in St. Vincent de Paul, like the area council, when I said, look, we need to modernise ourselves, we need to talk about what we're seeing on the ground, I was very swiftly isolated and shut down, and I suddenly became the pariah of all the presidents in the area. So very interesting point, and I think that's something that we're going to continue to struggle with.
I thank you for that response. I have a theological theory on it, but I'm not going to say it now because I'll end up eating up on the panel and the question time, but I'll save it for my wrapping up at the end. There's a question come through here from Rachel Mackerel, who is in the chat there, if you want to put your question, Rachel. And I'm maybe going to direct this question towards Nazia, so we can kind of go around the panelists. This is a very interesting, nuanced one. So take it away, Rachel, if you're able to. Or Rachel did warn me earlier, she might have children duties tonight. So
sorry, don't go for it. Kellie, go.
Like, no, I'm here.
No, please, I'm serving cereal here. You go for it.
Well, Rachel's just put a question here that I find quite interesting, that there's a kind of a difference between religion is kind of the value base that we see underpinning religion is a lot about compassion for people, about helping others, but human rights is based on a slightly different approach, which is about respecting the autonomy of others and the empowerment of others to help themselves. It's something that I have at times wondered if there's a kind of an individualism maybe as well in human rights that puts some people off when they come from a religious perspective that might be more collectivist in its thinking. So Nazia, would you like to take that one? Is that something you've ever sort of seen in action?
I mean, I totally get the point about compassion, but I think I think you can't respect people and enable them to help themselves unless you have compassion. I think the starting point has to be, I mean, why would you do it otherwise? It's, like I said, it's not an intellectual exercise. So I think what inspires so many human rights activists is compassion. It is being able to put themselves, if that was my child, if that was my daughter, if that was my son. So I don't think there's a contradiction there. I think it's a starting point, and it leads then to the next. So we all know that saying. You give a man a fish and you feed him for a day, and you teach him how to fish and you feed him for life. And that's very much, I think, integral to so many religions. Is that it should be an enabling thing, and this concept of dignity is so important to religion. And how do you give people dignity? Well, you help themselves, I suppose, isn't really even the phrase that I would use. And vulnerable people isn't a phrase that I would ever use. I don't think people are inherently vulnerable. I think we make them vulnerable. I think society puts up barriers that puts people in vulnerable situations, and it's our job as for people of faith to remove those barriers, to recognize that those barriers weren't put there by God, they were put there by human beings. So how do we remove those, and how do we enable people to live their best life regardless of their gender, their disability, their birth, and so on? So I don't think it's a contradiction. I think it's one is a consequence of the other, if that makes sense.
Thank you. There's a question here in the chat. Oh, sorry. I think somebody's. Yeah, it's fine. We're good. There's a question from Gareth Black, which I'll put to Alan. Gareth, are you available to ask your question? It's an interesting one in terms of getting into the nitty-gritty of what motivates people.
Sure. I verbally processed on my question, so let me just crystallize it down a little bit now that I've had 2 minutes to think about it. I'm just curious about whether you think your faith has informed your view of human rights in a way that if you didn't have faith, it wouldn't be informed. So we've talked about kind of the correlation between sort of growing up with an experience of faith and then a developing commitment to human rights. But I'm just wondering, are there aspects that you would feel of your faith that wouldn't be there? Sorry, of your convictions about human rights that you feel wouldn't be there if you didn't have faith?
No, I believe that the road that I was on probably would have led me to pretty much where I've ended up with regards to speaking up for the wee person. And I don't think you necessarily need to be a Christian to do that. In fact, I know many people who do that every day of the week and don't consider themselves to have any faith whatsoever. I suppose mine is maybe I suppose it's one of actually of being a wee bit sad that that there seems to be in the minds of some people a huge difference between people of faith and people with a human rights ideology, because I don't think that they should be as divorced as sometimes they appear to be, and maybe that's about the church and how the church has gone about its business. Judge that you've been adjudged seems to be something that seems to be lost in some of the churches, because especially if it's coming across with a very judgmental attitude. But I suppose what I would be saying, and I suppose it's the same for human rights activists, don't tar us all with the same brush. I think we've all I know many people of very strong convictions to faith that have done huge work for human rights. I also know others, I have to say to you, with Christian faith that have been hugely problematic for people and for rights and stuff like that. And I'm very much at the liberal end of the church. But so I suppose to answer your question, sorry for rambling a bit, I think that I probably would have been involved in human rights anyway, probably at that sort of grassroots, speaking up for the wee person type of thing. I mean, as I say, I was on the commission for six years, and to be honest with you, whilst it was a good experience and I learned a lot, I don't think commissioner level is me, at that sort of sitting around talking for hours about stuff. I like to see things happen, and I don't think in terms of commissions and stuff like that things happen fast enough. And I think it's more about just informing governments and generating paper and stuff like that. I think we also need to change things for people. And I suppose the biggest achievement I think I've had of my life, and something that gives me immense pride, and it wasn't something necessarily that I did myself, but certainly I played my part, was in getting the injured pension over the line, because I know that that's now benefiting thousands of people. And that was a group of remarkable individuals. None, I don't think, had faith. People who were disabled, blind, paraplegics, that took on government and took on Stormont, and took on all the cups of tea and the platitudes and the slaps in the back, and actually delivered. And I think that was just hugely humbling to actually walk with those people. And I was very proud to do it as a person of faith. But that's where it's at for me, and I do think that's where Christianity should be at as well as other faiths.
Okay. Thanks very much, Gareth. There's a question here from Diane, which I'll put. Anybody who wants to is welcome to take this one. Diane, are you available to ask your question? Bring lots of voices in.
Oh, hi, yeah. My interest in this whole discussion is because I did a project on religious women during the Troubles, and they were very reluctant to speak because of these various church scandals, and the sort of where they've been demonized and scapegoated for a lot of problems that were really societies rather than just the churches. And I found when I was wanting to talk to people about this research and about what religious women had actually done very quietly behind the scenes, people were saying, well, did you ask them about the Magdalene Laundries? Did you ask them about the mother and baby homes? And I said, well, my project wasn't about that. And I was very interested in the extent to which the overwhelming response to most people, because I was doing some, and I'm coming from the secular perspective. I'm a secular scholar that's always looked at religion and politics. And I was quite shocked at the extent to which that was everybody's focus, the negative part of religion. So I was very interested in the extent to which in your human rights activism, you might feel deterred to say, I'm motivated by faith. To what extent that would make people suspicious of you, or even hostile, because that's what I've encountered, real hostility and a rejection of the fact that people could act. And actually, the message that comes through from my work is that it was, and this was Protestant and Catholic women, is that they acted out of love. That was the main message, that you had to love people. And that seemed to be just completely rejected because, they're all evil, cruel people. So that's where the question comes from. And whether or not you can relate to that.
I can, Diane, absolutely. Kellie asked me privately whether I, practiced faith when she was organising this event, and I told her privately it's not something I would discuss publicly at all, because quite frankly, I am embarrassed to be a practicing member of the Catholic Church that has done so much wrong and caused so much hurt, particularly in Ireland, even though it has, if I really think about it, it's a huge part of my identity, and it had a huge role in my upbringing and in the decisions that I have made in my life. They all relate back to faith, and the faith of my family, and how I've been brought up as a Roman Catholic. But it is never something that I would be, I would be embarrassed, and to be honest, a wee bit ashamed to really say that I'm a woman of faith, and I'm acting as a woman of faith in my human rights activism. I just have to keep them completely detached from each other. So you're spot on with your research.
I wonder, as we maybe dig into this one a wee bit more, is there a way that we can, as human rights advocates and campaigners and activists, have pride in our faith in the work that we do? Is there a way that can happen?
Well, can I just point out that one of the things that I will always say to people when they're indicting the church is, have you heard of liberation theology? Are you aware of the numbers of priests and nuns that gave their lives taking the option for the poor in Latin America and not just there, and in many other places? And that's a whole side of the church. And Alan's dead right talking about the male egos and the hierarchy and the abuse of power that you see in church structures. But the church embraces, as everybody in it, those that are really right wing and those that are really left wing. And of course, liberation theology, which is that whole other side that is there to be admired and commended, but does not get the recognition it deserves, and which the hierarchy in the Vatican did an awful lot to destroy and diminish. So I'll leave it.
Now, I was just going to say, speaking to both of those points, can we take pride? I think we can take pride in really simple acts of love, as you said, Diane. When I was training to be, and this kind of goes back to Gareth's question as well, practically I wouldn't have been a volunteer for St. Vincent de Paul unless I had gone to church, because I had to sign up, in the parish office when I first went to Mass in North Belfast to say, yes, this is something I'd be interested in. And when I was doing my training, I went to a house, to a really dilapidated flat in the New Lodge, and it was a woman who was a recovering drug addict, and she had literally nothing, and she had received her flat for the first time. And watching Margaret, who is a woman of great faith, and a long-term volunteer for St. Vincent de Paul, how she treated that woman with utmost respect and dignity, how she spoke to her, how she used touch to show that everything was going to be okay, and that we were here to help, and that we weren't judging her on any decisions that she made. And the comfort that Margaret was able to give to that woman because of her faith, it made me so proud. And I think it's those little acts that are so often not heard about, and they are very private, and they should be very private, but they are the small things that I am proud of in terms of being a Catholic woman. And I would really like to hear more about those small things that people are doing.
Thank you. Nazia, do you want to come in?
Yes, Kellie, yeah, I think I find some of this incredibly sad, because for me, human rights activists are always up for a fight. So yes, I'm a Catholic, bring it on. Yes, I'm a Muslim, bring it on. Do you have a problem with that? Let's hear about it. And I think for me, hiding it, being Muslim is so integral to my identity. It's so integral to how I see the world that I would find it very difficult to hide it. And sometimes I find it putting it on display even when I don't need to. So I remember working for the Commission and having a meeting at the Home Office on the racial equality strategy. And as the meeting ended, I said to the guy hosting the meeting, I want to pray. Where can I pray? It's time for the afternoon prayer. And just about testing the waters. But I think the sort of common theme that we're hearing is that organizations, whether they're religious organizations or whether they're human rights organizations, are generally not great at selling what it is they're supposed to be selling. Alan, spoken about one particular one, and I'm glad he said all that with his first-hand experience. And so I don't think any more than we would expect a human rights activist to have to apologize for everything a Human Rights Commission has ever done or failed to do. I really don't see why religious people always feel the need to do that. The Catholic Church is a huge organization. I just find it sad that you would feel the need to explain and justify what they're doing. Your religion is your religion, it's yours. No one else can claim it or should take it away from you.
Thank you. Alan, did you want to?
I just really, I suppose for me, I wanted to distill everything down to pretty much two values, because I think that human rights and everything that flows from that should come out of these two values. And the two values are this: that one, that you believe that you as a person are of worth, I think that's fundamental, and I think that that's really, really important, that you believe in yourself. And secondly, that you believe that others are of worth also. And I think if you kind of can instill everything down into those two values, that will dictate in many respects to how you treat other people. Doesn't necessarily mean that we'll agree, but it ought to govern how we disagree. And I think that that's where I would be coming from as a human rights activist, as a Christian. I'll always be on the side of the wee person, because I think that's important, and that's activism. And you know, I've been doing this for such a long time now, and I don't always see much success, to be quite honest with you. Sometimes there are so many barriers in the road, and sometimes they're put there by politicians, sometimes they're put there by churches, sometimes, dare I say it, they're put there by people with huge egos that operate under the guise of being human rights activists. But at the end of the day, if you're not helping the wee person, well then you really can't call yourself either a person of faith or a human rights activist, because I think that's what it's about. And I understand that we have to change structures, and we have to to move structural inequalities and all of that, absolutely, and it takes politicians and people in power to do that. But they also have to remember who they are accountable to, and they should always only ever be accountable to the wee people.
Thank you. I think we're probably going to need to finish up soon, because we've kept everybody a little bit over what we committed to. Just having a last quick look at the chat. Paula has put into the chat that it would be great to see if there are any resources out there that are kind of scripture-based resources on human rights. So that's not something that I would have to hand, but it certainly sounds like a challenge, Paula. So I will I will look into that, and if our panelists had anything to recommend, it would be great. Because I think sometimes that is really important, that creating a bridge for people to be able to kind of hear things articulated in a language that's familiar, in a language that doesn't feel like something external to what they know. And I'm going to just briefly mention the point on the kind of the church's reluctance to really speak with one unified voice, as Ciara said, on issues of inequality, particularly social inequality. My own experience of that is kind of a theological working out of things that I've felt over my journey, and I can only speak from like a sort of evangelical Protestant Christian kind of perspective, a bit like Alan's, but that there's something so kind of inherently like the kind of the predestination type, God has planned your life out, you're the scripture verse, for I know the plans I have for you, says the Lord, plans to give you a hope and a future, and all of the ways that scripture is kind of used to construct an idea that all the days of your life are written down in the book, that the idea of inequality throws that all on its head. The idea that the world is stacked against some people, that there are these man-made structures, as Nazia said, it's not things that God put in place, it's things that people put in place, that mean that actually affect the course of your life, that affect how your life is going to be lived and your outcomes, and whether or not you reach your potential, that is actually quite a scary concept. It shakes some people's theology to the core. That kind of existential sense that God has everything planned. And I really believe that that is one of the biggest barriers, particularly a lot of Christian churches and organizations fully throwing their weight behind tackling structural inequality. I think it runs theologically very deep, and it brings, I guess it brings back to David's original question. We need a more progressive theology. We need theologies that don't depend on ideas like that. To see a more active kind of response when it comes to actually tackling inequality, accepting that life is messy and it's also very unequal, and we should be doing something about that. Folks, there are still a few comments there in the chat, but I think they're kind of more comments and questions, and a little bit of like, we need to do this again. We need to take this a bit further. So hopefully that is something that we can do. I want to thank the festival for accepting this event, because it is great to have a conversation like this on a platform that is as as broad, as accessible as the Human Rights Festival. And but I mostly want to thank Nazia, Ciara and Alan, our three panelists, for speaking so personally about their own experiences and journeys, and frustrations and things that you celebrate, and for just being brilliant, especially on a night when I'm not feeling very brilliant with my COVID brain. So you've been absolutely wonderful. I really appreciate it. And thanks to everybody who's come along and participated in the discussion. And I will send a little follow-up email with some resources if I'm able to, and hopefully we can do this again sometime. So all the best, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.